Hello everyone, hello and welcome. So my name is Tao Fan, I'm from Monash University, and it's my great privilege today to welcome you all to this event celebrating the launch of Dr. Benjamin Hegarty's debut book, Made Up State, Technology, Femininity and Citizenship in Indonesia. To begin, I'd like to first start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, water and skies of the place we gather today, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present, and to our friends joining online, I'd also like to extend this acknowledgement to all the traditional custodians of the places that you're based, whatever it is that you're being from. I'd like to acknowledge that sovereignty here was never ceded, and to take this moment to also recognise this event takes place at a particularly stressful time for many of our Indigenous friends and colleagues, as the racism of the colonial nation finds its focal point in the voice referendum. And so solidarity and strength to anyone who needs it. So, thank you, Ben, for writing this wonderful book and inviting us all here to celebrate with you. This is a book about post-colonial gender making, about warriors or trans feminine people in Indonesia. It's about technologies of modern selfhood, of citizenship and belonging, and the forms of labour and negotiation that go into the production of state recognition. This is a profoundly significant book for scholars in science and technology studies, gender and sexuality studies, trans studies, anthropology, cultural studies, and much, much more. Over the next hour, we'll hear from three excellent discussants who'll be reflecting on the themes and arguments presented in the book and why they matter for us now. Carla Jones, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Colorado Boulder, Alegra Wolter, a trans physician and diverse leadership in medicine, public health, community empowerment, health advocacy, technology and research, and Chris Hanssmann, an assistant professor of gender, sexuality and women's studies at the University of California, Davis. And their full bios are on the table there if you'd like to have a look. Our speakers are all international, so have all kindly pre-submitted and pre-recorded their videos. And then we'll, of course, be hearing from the author himself, who'll be responding to the videos and reading us passages from the manuscript. We'll then have lots of time at the end for questions and some discussion, so please write down any questions you have for them. And we've got drinks, snacks, and importantly at the end, I'm sure Ben will make some time for some book signing for us as well. So a few housekeeping things. The brilliant Karina, Program Coordinator Extraordinaire for the Science and Society Network, is going to be taking pictures, so please let us know if you prefer not to be in any of the photographs. This event is also being live streamed on YouTube, so I encourage people watching to add your questions, live comments, etc. to the YouTube chat. We're also live hosting the event on the platform formerly known as Twitter. So if you are, tweeting or whatever it is along as well, tag at SSN Deakin and use the hashtags #MadeUpState, #SSN Book Launch. And very importantly, for those of you in the room, hard copies of the book are also for sale for $20 each at the back there, with all proceeds going to the Warrior Crisis Centre in Yogyakarta for projects related to trans health and housing. So, without further ado then, I'd like to introduce our author. Benjamin Hegarty is a medical anthropologist working at the intersection of queer and transgender studies, science and technology studies, and global health. His research is based on transgender communities in Indonesia. He gained his PhD in anthropology at ANU in 2018. His first position was here in gender and sexuality studies at Deakin University. He's held postdocs at the University of California, Irvine and University of Melbourne, and is currently a medical anthropologist in the Global Health Program at the Kirby Institute at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. His ethnographic and historical research appears in Visual Anthropology Review, Ethos, Journal of the History of Sexuality, and the Journal of Asian Studies. Benjamin's also a member of the editorial board of American Ethnologists, and the Made Up State, Technology, Femininity and Citizenship in Indonesia is his first book, published in Cornell University Press and gloriously open access as a gift to us all. So to kick us off, our first video is going to be from Carla Jones.
Thank you for the invitation to join this celebration of Benjamin Hegarty's excellent new ethnography, The Made Up State, Technology, Femininity and Citizenship in Indonesia. This is a wonderful book, And I've thoroughly enjoyed seeing it develop from dissertation phase to its current form now out in the world. At its root, it does something basic and fundamental that is relatable to all people who might read it. And that is that it relays a basic and utterly familiar desire. That is the capacity to move through time and space safely as oneself. Benjamin Hegarty traces this desire through the lives and experiences of waria, trans women in Indonesia. In his analysis, he traces beautifully this interplay between the role of technology and the role of technology in producing something that looks fundamentally non-technological, which is femininity. Femininity is something that is supposed to be a sort of unconscious, unself-aware expression of some profound soul or self. Instead, Hegarty shows through the sort of daily lives and also through a very nuanced archival historical account of how Indonesian waria have never simply thought that they were expressing something natural, but rather recruited and deployed a national agenda during the Suharto era to produce themselves as recognizably feminine and therefore as legitimate citizens. He shows how this recruitment and deployment of a visible mastery over something that could arguably be dismissed as superficial, that is the alteration of the surface, is a way of staking a claim in membership in an otherwise cisgender Indonesian lexicon of citizenship. What I find particularly compelling about this argument is that he recruits this idea of dandan, the practice of undergoing the transformation of the self to make oneself up. Very often for public visibility, one does not undergo dandan just to be around the house or even to hang out with one's neighbors in one's neighborhood, but instead for a particular kind of audience. And he uses this as a way of attaching something that seems otherwise really quite superficial to the otherwise profoundly recognizable and legitimate project of Indonesian nationalism. So for these waria, as he shows, and also through this very detailed and beautiful archival and media research, these waria find themselves able to make a claim on Indonesian citizenship by saying that making themselves up is not just a superficial activity, but is instead a way of recruiting a set of expertise and skills that are equivalent to being an engineer, being able to design a national airplane or some kind of heavy-duty, mechanical, and arguably more masculine kind of mastery. He does this through both archival research, but also beautifully through ethnography. My favorite scenes in the book are those that trace and experience the desire to be able to move through space, particularly through this urban space in the city, and therefore as an equivalent of moving through and being visible in the nation, but doing so in ways that run the risk of being arrested, of being harassed, of potentially being injured or killed, and of doing it alongside his interlocutors. So we experience along with these interlocutors their recollections of the past, their desires for being able to move through time and space, and moving with them through time and space. This is incredibly gripping. So I'm particularly drawn to both the scenes, both at night, but also in neighborhoods where waria go out in house dresses and are able to just interact with other housewives in ways that make them recognizably feminine, even though they are not as done as one might be for a more public audience. You experience along with them then the moments of comfort where they're accepted and the moments of risk or discomfort. And this is only possible through the time-consuming, careful, hard work, but also rewarding work of ethnography, in which you come to have extended relationships with other people. And through Benjamin Hegarty's careful ethnographic work, we, alongside those interlocutors, desire and honor their desire to be seen and to also see. Now, what's important here, I think, is also the fact that this moment occurred in a moment in Indonesia historically where there was what arguably a kind of techno-fetishism. And we see this even more since the conclusion of Hegarty's research. So, for example, the most recent presidential projects of Joko Widodo, we see a very clear focus on the sort of attention to infrastructure, the attention to technological achievements as standing in for recognizably developed national status. So what we see then is a way in which waria women, trans women, are seeking a kind of visibility in a particular kind of national landscape. So I would like to conclude by asking a few questions that I find not as something lacking in the book, but rather the kinds of places that the beautiful argument almost forces us and hopefully leads us to pose. First, we cannot help but notice that Indonesian anxieties about LGBTQ citizenship and membership and visibility, two basic human rights in Indonesia, have only become more acute since the time of Hegarty's research. Indeed, the 2022 Criminal Code both criminalizes and authorizes forms of conduct that make life for some non-conforming Indonesians more safe, and for other non-conforming Indonesians less safe. I'm sure that many of the other commentators in this session are also noting the fact that the forms of open risk and hate even towards trans individuals is as high as I have seen it in 3 decades of familiarity with Indonesian public life, and that this is a moment of genuine concern for those of us who are interested in the experiences and safety and lives of trans Indonesians, as well as lesbian and gay as well. But I also note that this is also a moment of increased trans visibility globally, not just within Indonesia, and that the rise of cultures of expertise emerging to either treat, diagnose, or soothe, therapeutic industries designed to soothe trans subjectivity have also become much more proficient and prolific. Where I am in the United States, and particularly where I am in Colorado in the United States, this has become a very powerful and visible feature of political discourse, as well as of medical discourse, and forms of sort of morality speech around parental rights and children's rights, in a way that just simply hasn't been visible, say, 5 or 10 years ago. So what I would like to ask is how we might use Hegarty's work to think more broadly beyond Indonesia. Hegarty concludes the book with a beautiful summary of how the sort of precarious lives of trans women in Indonesia are, in fact, built on a kind of persistent binary, but that this is one that shifts over time, and that the future for waria is in no way foreordained, simply because, as he shows us so beautifully, it was never foreordained over the decades of research that he analyzes. And yet those of us who are anthropologists also know that Indonesia has long been central to the production of classic and profound anthropological knowledge, particularly over the last century, from Margaret Mead to Clifford Geertz, Jim Peacock, Anat Singh, Barry Steedley, and many, many more. These are all people who really helped anthropology as a field developed its knowledge as well as its theories about what it means to be human. So rather than consider Indonesia and the Indonesian case of the sort of experiences of waria as an exceptional case, either of transsubjectivity and acceptance or of the pernicious persistence of binary models of gender and sexuality, I think that Benjamin Hegarty's analysis invites scholars of gender, sexuality, and subjectivity to consider how these examples reveal the other persistent feature of many claims to trans rights. And that is the idea of the individual as a prior, discrete figure whose identity is either accepted or rejected in the world beyond the self. So instead, warias and Hegarty's analysis of their lives and desires underscores the inverse, that is the fundamentally social quality of all human life, whether it's perceived as conforming or non-conforming. So I welcome this book as a provocation to scholars, of course, of Indonesia, but also of elsewhere, to revisit the impulse to think of the self as somehow outside of history, or of publics, or of politics, or of simply other human beings. And I hope this book will allow scholars of subjectivity to interrogate the ways in which the self is made and circulates problematically as singular, and yet can never do that. It can never circulate on its own. The idea itself, it requires these other subjects. So the idea of the subject as discrete is always tied to powerful institutions, and this book helps us to see that that is the question that I think we can really benefit from, both as scholars of Indonesia, but also as scholars of contemporary life. Thanks to Benjamin Hegarty for writing it, and I hope that the discussion is productive. Thank you.
I'm going to invite them to respond with the reading, and we'll take some Carla questions at the end as well.
Great. Thank you so much, thank you so much to the Deakin SDS community and the Science and Society Network for putting this on and for having me today to be able to discuss my book. I really appreciate it. I'm really grateful also to Dr. Tao Fan for her wonderful moderation and interest in the work. When Carla was speaking, I was thinking, well, before Carla was speaking, I was thinking I'm going to kind of launch into one particular passage, but then I kind of thought, well, there were several passages that might be useful or interesting to discuss in response to her comments. So what I might do is I might jump to a particular point in the book that responds to her question about the utility of this kind of work, I guess, more generally, right, in terms of thinking about, say, queer and feminist studies, transgender studies, and how we think about the relationship between gender and the self. I think that it's a really important question that Carla poses, and it's a really challenging one for an anthropologist to respond to, given that often anthropology these days, ethnographic work, is reduced, I guess, to a series of case studies of elsewhere that are kind of consumed by a Euro-American kind of metropole. So this book, I hope, doesn't do that, although I guess it's really hard to escape the kind of research worlds and readership that we're trained into. But on that note, I'll jump straight to a passage that addresses the question of the transgender and cisgender binary, which is, I guess, an emergent binary that we're seeing used consistently across scholarship, across theory, and across, I guess, popular political discourse. So I'll just go straight in. Okay. A socio-technical approach, so just a fancy way of saying that social and technological features of gender, approach to the history of waria also helps to consider the utility of cisgender as a universally applicable term when applied at the level of the individual. Cisgender, often presented on binary terms with transgender, has achieved near hegemonic status in Euro-American theory and politics as a concept that normatively refers to individuals, quote, individuals who possess from birth and into adulthood the male or female reproductive organs, sex, typical of the social category of man or woman, gender, to which that individual was assigned at birth, end quote, and that quote is from the TSQ entry on cisgender. Yet any insistence on separating out individuals according to an essential difference between cisgender and transgender at the level of the individual comes with significant risks, given the set of Euro-American assumptions about personhood upon which this understanding rests. When interpreted via a concept of personhood based on the bounded self, the cisgender-transgender binary appears to smuggle an essentialist model of biological sex into a definition of psychological gender. The view that an alignment of sex and gender is possible at all reads onto the body one Euro-American model of personhood in which the individual can be separated out from society. Far from facilitating a radical critique of gender, the mapping of individuals onto a binary grid of cisgender, transgender in this way reflects an ethnocentric redeployment of the nature-culture binary. Sandy Stone, foundational trans studies scholar Sandy Stone long ago critiqued the limits of theoretical perspectives premised on an ontologized gender in her critical interrogation of dominant accounts of transsexuality in terms of the wrong body, pinpointing their tendency to, quote, foreclose the possibility of analyzing desire and motivational complexity, end quote. Gender and the cisgender transgender binary that it increasingly requires for legibility is not the ground onto which individuals emerge, but a technology of classification.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Thank you.
I love this. I would love to get back to this. The irony that non-binary binary is itself a binary
Yes.
is something I think I would love to unpack in the discussion later. So I'm going to now invite the next video to be played from Alegra Wolter.
Hello everyone, my name is Alegra Wolter. I'm a transgender physician, an activist for gender equality and also diversity in Indonesia. I am also a friend, a dear friend, and also colleague of Dr. Benjamin Hegarty, who has been my mentor, wonderful friend, and also really great supporter towards my career and my life in general. I am really grateful for the opportunity to share and give my commentary to the awesome book, one of Dr. Hegarty's wonderful work, The Made Up State. It is definitely a groundbreaking and also like a novel research that explores the experiences of transgender women, particularly known as warias in the Indonesian context, and now with the new terminology, trans women, especially in the context of the post-colonial political and also urban transformation era in Indonesia. It really dissects carefully and analyzes and examines how the trans and the identities emerge after Indonesian post-colonial political urban transformation. The book really highlights the significance of all the work, all the good things that warias have been doing through stories and achievements and their impact towards the Indonesian society in general. It emphasizes on the importance of understanding the intersections of gender, in which we really want to see in terms of how we belong in the society and as a community in general. It really transforms the idea of reclaiming femininity in terms of our gender and making it legitimized in the technical sense of how we navigate ourselves in the society, in the structured binary world that we live in. I think that a lot of scholars have put and shared their contextual knowledge and also commentary input to Dr. Hegarty's work, and I really think that this book really highlights the exploration of the idea of being seen and accepted as part of the society, being a gender diverse person per se. And it gives us a lot of nuance and also analysis on the agency and also the resilience of the transgender community in general, which I think really drift away from the narrative that we see nowadays. Sometimes we see a lot of narratives in which it really highlights only the sad part of the idea of living as a trans person. While in this book, I see that there's a lot of beauty, a lot of strength, and a lot of resilience that we need to uphold. And we need to really support how any type of work in terms of social sciences being integrated into the Indonesian science and being made an evidence-based information that we can learn on. I think coming from the background of medicine, medical science in general, we really need more lenses in terms of anthropology, sociology, and other social sciences in which it could capture gender diversity and how we as a society can become more and more gender and culturally sensitive. I'm really proud and happy with this book launch, Dr. Hegarty, which I think it's a really major achievements and how we value our history and develop more knowledge and also insights to how gender diverse people were thriving in this country. We're seeing a lot of struggles and a lot of strength as well in one place. And I really think that it really holds significance and also the relevancy in terms of peer studies, gender studies, and also Southeast Asian studies in general and beyond. Thank you so much, Dr. Hegarty, for inviting me to be part of this commentary board. I'm really proud of what you're doing. And as a colleague, I think that we really need more experts like you that could really contribute a lot into the Indonesian society, not in a separate way, but as part of our community and our culture, using definitely community-based participatory approach and how we can work together towards the better Indonesia in terms of science in this sense. I really hope that in the future we can really go beyond the binary of gender. And in this book, I think we're seeing a lot of sense, much beyond the transgender community, but how we as a society navigate gender and how we put ourselves in the role that we want to do in life. And nowadays, I'm seeing a lot of young and ambitious transgender people coming throughout different background, different studies, different work, and those are the transformations that we want to see. And I'm really proud of the transgender community as well. We're being part of this book in general and also the wider society in general. Thank you so much.
Favorite part about book launches is when friends come and express their is that one of your interlocutors as well in the book?
No, not in this book, though kind of a close, I guess, intellectual collaborator and, oh, sorry, the microphone. Is that okay? Yeah. Is it on? Is that correct? Is that correct? Yeah. Kind of collaborator and kind of, I don't know, friend, intellectual companion. And Alegra is phenomenal in so many ways, but also, if I share the news that she's been awarded a prestigious scholarship to come and study a Master of Public Health at the University of New South Wales next year. So really excited to continue the collaborative and participatory research that Alegra kind of mentioned, which is, I guess, in a sense, the ground was laid through this book, but takes on a very different format. Yeah, really phenomenal and lucky to have such incredible interlocutors. Yeah, and collaborators.
Would you like to read a passage
Sure.
in response to this one as well?
Sure. This one, I guess I'll just go straight from right at the beginning of the book, page 1. So, sorry, now I need to find it. So this will just kind of, I guess, set the scene in a sense for some of the kind of discussion that Alegra mentioned. So Maya Puspa steps out of her home and salon with confidence and grace, narrowly avoiding the puddles that have transformed her lane into a muddy track. She smiles, arching her thin, penciled-on eyebrows as she turns to a group of elderly men gathered over a chessboard. It is her evening walk, and, cheerily greeting the men, Maya strides out of her lane and onto a city street. Maya lives alone in one of the many poor, crowded neighborhoods in Jakarta, the enormous capital of Indonesia, and a city in the center of a region populated by tens of millions of people. Enveloped by twilight, accompanied by the sounds of motorbikes and crackling evening calls to prayer from neighborhood mosques, Maya pushes on with athletic strength. She quickens her pace far more than her 80-year-old frame would suggest is possible. Neighbors call out to her with the common greeting, "Where are you going?" One middle-aged man on his way to the mosque, with a prayer rug slung over his shoulder and dressed in a sarong, grins as he spots Maya, greeting her with an honorific term of address reserved for senior members of the community. Her movement up the street is less a stroll and more a vigorous stop-start, punctuated by warm greetings and playful cajoling from her neighbours. After powering up a steep rise, Mummy Maya reaches a bridge that marks a halfway point to the community meeting that is our destination, before turning back to face the lights of the city. She surveils, with visible pleasure, the metropolis where she has made her home for over 60 years and where she plans to live out the rest of her days. This scene, unfolding in the middle of 2015, is a remarkable testament to Maya's neighbours' recognition of her as a respected member who belongs in their community on terms that are comfortable to her. I don't know whether I should continue or...
We've got time.
You've got time? Or should I go to another little section? I'm not sure. But I'll might just finish this up. But born in 1938 in a town on the island of Sumatra in the last decade of the colonial Dutch East Indies, Maya migrated to Jakarta in 1950, not long after the revolution that followed World War II and Indonesia's declaration of independence on the 17th of August 1945. Since that time, Maya has been an active participant in the vibrant social life that the city offers to newcomers from all around the sprawling archipelago nation of Indonesia. More successful than most, Maya runs a salon from the first floor of her humble 2-story shop house. Her salon is overflowing with sparkling sequin dresses on dusty mannequins, rows of gold embroidered blazers in dry cleaning wrappers, and old salon equipment. She demonstrates her youthful beauty with framed portraits of her younger self in a glamorous and skillfully executed modern style of femininity back in the 1960s. One framed photograph on the wall above her is an image of her wearing a carnival outfit replete with a gold crown and low-cut top. Although transformed by old age, she remains viewed by many of her neighbours as a person who in many respects demonstrates the values that are associated with a modern body, of which her polished femininity is a crucial attribute.
Beautiful, thank you so much. All right, I'd like to invite the final speaker now, Chris Hanssmann.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Hanssmann. I'm an assistant professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies at UC Davis in California, in the US. And I'm delighted to join you all today to talk about Ben Hegarty's wonderful book, The Made Up State. This is a book about how public gender ends up being a primary feature of citizenship as it was produced in the 20th century in Indonesia, and how warias were central to this process rather than marginal to it. It ends up being a really incisive analysis, I think, that animates and extends a series of important debates in trans studies and anthropology and history and beyond about terminology, about technology, about citizenship, about medical and psychological knowledge, and about legal and regulatory governance. And in this manner ends up being a very sort of sweeping analysis and a very effective one, even as it's doing all of that work. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the book in general and its contributions to varying fields in which it's working, as well as a couple of different concepts that really caught my attention, and to end on just a couple of questions. So from the vantage point of trans studies, which is sort of the field in which I partially situate myself, this book contributes to efforts to provincialize transgender. And this is how RNA Suara and others have described the process of needing to refuse fake universality and ethnocentrism of transgender as a global umbrella term, and to reject that in a manner. Increasingly, trans studies scholars are critiquing these storylines about global gender variance through what Stuart Hall has called the West and the Rest. And sometimes scholars are turning these critical reflections to the field itself. And I just wanted to give an example of that. I was recently reading the latest issue of Trans Studies Quarterly, one of the landmark journals within trans studies, and was caught by a graduate student's vision for the future of the field. So Shiv.Sharma, a student at Emory, writes, "This is what I want for the future of trans studies, an engagement, one that is rigorous, imaginative, playful, with non-Western modes of conceptualizing transness that does not simply recognize and affirm them as a matter of the diversity of other identities, but sees them as interventions that can expand and transform the discourse on trans identity and personhood in the West itself." So thinking with that sort of vision for the field, I would suggest that Dr. Hegarty's book does just this, and perhaps more. So he tells the story of waria and gendered citizenship through Dutch colonial history, through globalizing authoritarianism, and through public governance. And in doing so, he provides a really rich alternative to theorizing gender as, one might say, an individual identity game. So in doing so, he's joining a number of scholars, including C. Riley Snorton, P.J. De Pietro, Luana Berkins, Kaji Amin, and Jules Peterson, among many others, to examine this question of gender through colonial relations, through race, and through collective citizenship, rather than simply through paradigms of interiority and individualism. So I'd say this attention to relationality and collectivity is important. It's really his focus on the sort of realm of the dynamic social that provides Hegarty with the tools to analyze citizenship and racialized gender in a way that departs from the liberal obsession with the individual actor. This also makes a really important contribution to studies of gendered sexuality through its attention to distinct historical and transnational regimes of social differentiation. In his work, he also really generatively contributes to social sciences and historical studies of citizenship by paying very close attention to the sort of unruliness of subjective self-fashioning. And this ends up being a point that's often glossed over in citizenship studies and in political science. I also want to mention overall that Hegarty holds a great regard for his study interlocutors, which is something that's very important and often not necessarily highlighted. Right? And we can see this in the book's content, as well as in its insistence on warias as engaging in deep theorizing, rather than simply being sources of data or so-called sources of local knowledge. And that ends up also being very important because that is not always the way things have gone, particularly in anthropology. So it's a notable feature of the work, and I think one to celebrate. And finally, I appreciate the way that Hegarty sort of walks the talk and has chosen to publish The Made Up State as an open source book, which is a reflection of a commitment to a broader project of knowledge production, and one that can hopefully move well beyond the academy. Overall, I'm really eager to see this book taken up as a teaching tool in trans and gendered sexuality studies, in social sciences, in political science, and in history, as well as in community and organization-specific reading and study groups and beyond. I think there's a lot here for everyone. I want to keep these comments relatively brief, so I'm just going to focus on a couple of concepts that struck me as I read this wonderful book. So first I want to start with the question of labor. So one of the things that really distinguishes Hegarty's book is its insistence on centering the role of capitalist production and development in the story about the emergence of new order logics of gender and sexuality. Questions of political economy form another essential area of inquiry within trans studies. And this conversation was staged in part in 2017, also in Trans Studies Quarterly, in the issue on trans political economy, edited by Dan Irving and Vec Lewis.
Just 1 second, we're just correcting a slight glitch in the video.
So we might read Vec Lewis, edited by Dan Irving and Vec Lewis. This still remains an area that demands quite a bit more attention, and Hegarty's book answers this call. So in the second chapter of the book, Hegarty discusses how the dominant labor industry for warias in the late 1960s and early 70s, throughout the 70s, shifted in part from sex work to beauty industries with the inauguration of Suharto's New Order regime. And it was within this regime that narrow conceptions of so-called normal gender came to figure really centrally into notions of citizenship and state governance. And Hegarty shows how the sort of narrowness of permissible gendered citizenship ended up defining warias or waram as a public problem, especially in the context of street-based sex work. So the so-called solution to this problem materialized in large part through the inauguration of the city-run guidance programs that he writes about. And these strove to usher participants away from sex work and into these sort of formalized economies of hairdressing and cosmetology. These were also the programs that Jakarta Governor Ali Sadikin championed through anti-poverty urban reforms. And among other things, it was enrollment into these programs that brought about some of the conditional and partial forms of inclusion that extended state recognition to what Hegarty calls legal but non-conforming status for warias. So we might read this through respectability politics, and that's certainly one kind of trajectory that we could follow. But as Hegarty emphasizes, it was also a means of harnessing labor power in the formal sector and national economy. So through what he calls the disciplinary apparatus of guidance, this work in the technologies of femininity then became efforts in national and economic development. And Hegarty is careful here to attend to the sort of intensely patriarchal and coercive tenor of these programs, and also to the broader role that they served, that these guidance programs served in the state development and tools of resource extraction, territorial expansion, and other forms of dispossession. So he's not celebrating them here. Yet, he also emphasizes that these programs enabled new forms of freedom, constrained as it was, to warias. And it was in part through these disciplining state tactics, for example, that warias came to be defined through possessing an expertise in feminine beauty in service to the nation. So this not only had some influence on the material possibilities of waria life, it also exposed the fissures and contradictions in authoritarian state publics. So in these and in other ways, warias seized or leveraged forms of freedom that were decidedly not on the terms of city or state government, even if doing so also potentially cut them off from more capacious forms of freedom. So this is a kind of approach that really helps us to cut a path to thinking through a materialist lens about the possibilities and limits of regimes of recognition and inclusion. And in addition, I think here, Hegarty really guides his readers to think through the construction of citizenship and state economic development as it's articulated at the scale of the city, pointing out that municipal governance of gender non-normativity led to state conceptions of gendered citizenship rather than the reverse. So this question of city-level concerns then point me to the second point that I'd like to discuss, and that is the role of medicine and psychiatry in this story. So as somebody who's interested in science and technology studies and social sciences of medicine, this is a sort of sort of trajectory that really interests me. And particularly in trans studies, and especially where I'm located in the US, this is sort of arguably founded, this field is arguably founded as a rejoinder to medical and psychiatric pathologization. So it ends up being a real sort of center of gravity for questions of trans studies. And so Hegarty's book shows how in Indonesia, the making of public gender was similarly routed through transnational science and scientific and medical knowledge, but also shows how it was largely through its enduring exchanges with city level concerns about public order and morality that those ideas were also fashioned. So in chapter 3, he asserts that Euro-American psychiatric regimes were sort of selectively translated and interpreted, and that these translations lent to a fixation on stability of gender identity on the part of state officials. This ended up becoming a very central concern in the way that citizenship and public gender were being worked out, inaugurating what Josgel Peterson has referred to as the cisgender state, or perhaps we might call it in this context the cisgender city, if we're to take seriously Hegarty's arguments about scale. So for example, as he argues in chapter 2, lower level municipal authorities really drew on these patchworks of knowledge, including, but well beyond these translations of medical and scientific knowledge, to govern gender non-normativity in public and to make meaning about what he is in the process. So this led to essentializing logics at the level of the state, but as Hegarty points out, what he has largely evaded what he calls the state's monopoly on recognition on the meanings of gender. And Warias did so not really through a sort of head-on confrontation with these logics, but rather by leaning into a different form of technological expertise through self-cultivation and feminized beauty. So I would suggest that this approach really helps us flesh out a more robust account of the workings of pathologization more broadly, and in ways that would be effective across transnational sites of study. So to echo some of Hegarty's claims, I would really emphasize the importance of looking well beyond the concerns of medicine and psychiatry if we're to truly understand the workings of the processes that we might call pathologization. And I think this book is a really effective demonstration of one way to do that. In addition, I think it's a transnational moment that's marked by a renewed authoritarian interest in gender and sexuality. And in this way, it's really instructive to look to some of the specific forms and scales of relation that produce public meanings about bodily cultivation. And this book also offers that really richly. And I lastly just want to wrap up by thanking Dr. Hegarty so much for writing this book and for inviting me to contribute comments. I also like to thank the other contributors for taking part in the work to think together and to celebrate the arrival of this excellent book. And I'm really just looking forward to, all of its contributions and the lines of inquiry that it opens up, and really look forward to continuing these conversations. Thank you.
Brilliant. I really loved what Chris said there about the different scales of labour and governance, sort of at the level of the body, the level of the city, the level of the state, and the role of and all those, how those different scales go into the making of what we assume to be these sort of essentialized categories or forms of controls from the work of pathologization, for example, but also working through those same scales to undo those very techniques.
Yeah, thank you.
Is there something you'd like to, a passage you'd like to read to speak to those scales as well, or to questions of labour in particular?
Yeah, thank you, Tal. I think that's right. I think a really central part of the story is the way that warias have navigated public space, and particularly the regulation of their presence in public space, stretching back to really the colonial period during the period of the Dutch East Indies. And some of the, just to give a side note, the chapter 2, I think, is a really, it's work that I hadn't published elsewhere and that was based on some new research that found some really interesting, I guess, precedents for the management of binary gender in Indonesian cities through, in relation to the management of race and racialization of public space in Indonesian social life. So the Dutch East Indies was really governed through as a racially segregated society that divided its population into the legal categories of European, foreign Oriental, which is more or less Chinese and other East Asians, and Indigenous or Native. And there was marked separations of those categories at many levels, but including at the spatial level. So who could occupy what spaces at what times of day? So indeed, present Indonesian regulations governing public space, so those focused particularly on forms of what are called regulations or codes governing public morality and public nuisance, really, I think genealogically you can see their inheritances in relation to race. So I think this relationship between racial categorization and gender categorization are a really crucial part of the story that's often missed or glossed when thinking about the relationship between coloniality and gender. So I would just add that as a little side note. But what shall I say? I'll go straight into my city, introducing that interesting city governor, Alisa Deakin, who played a central role in pathologizing, but also kind of offering spaces in support of waria in the 1960s, and who in fact inaugurated the term. So the term waria, I should say probably, is the term that I use throughout the book. It's a really interesting term because its history doesn't lie in, say, tradition, say, forms of ritual practice that are often understood as the domain of non-Western transgender categories. Rather, it's a modern category that emerged or was established in the late 1960s at the invitation of a city governor, which is really kind of weird when you think about it. Why would a city mayor or governor be interested in transgender categorization? However, I think that history is nicely unpacked, if you don't mind me saying so, by this kind of trying to understand the relationship between the regulation of public space and the definition of gender, or what it means to be gendered in Indonesia. So just to say that's the backstory. But here I go. So to the Jakarta municipal government in the late 1960s, the increasing visibility of bunchies, which is another term for gender variance in Indonesia, earlier than waria and now has a rather derogatory meaning, but was commonly used until the 1960s. The increasing visibility of bunchies on the streets of the city could no longer be swept aside. Even as it had long featured as a component of urban life, stretching records go back to the 19th century, gender nonconformity was increasingly discussed in the pages of the popular press and in the offices of City Hall as a cause for concern. In early New Order Jakarta, and New Order being the period when the military general Suharto was president from 68 to 98, so I'm giving these little notes, a broad cross-section of the city's residents remarked on the brazen visibility of what was seen as the gender nonconformity of bunchies, mostly as a novelty or a problem to be solved. Sensational reports asserted that some 15,000 bunchies resided in the city. Claims that the city was being inundated served as justification for an unprecedented campaign with the twin aims of educating the public and intensifying the regulation of public space, really through police, imposition of new forms of policing. Complaints about gender nonconformity, consistent with those that had been raised since the colonial period, largely focused on its public visibility. The increased visibility of bunchies, however, prompted the city to modify its strategies that were deployed to contain it. This view is reflected in one police spokesperson's statement justifying police raids on the grounds that warias created an unpleasant view along the sides of Jakarta's newly constructed highways, especially for foreign guests. So far from a superficial matter, public gender served as a key means through which individuals could be included or excluded from participation in the city. Within the apparatus of governing citizenship, warias played a central role. In order to better evaluate and solve what the city framed as a stubborn problem, municipal authorities worked with psychiatrists and other medical experts to assess and interpret warias down to the minutiae of bodily appearance and indeed what times of day whether they wore what clothing. These efforts at definitional clarity resulted in the introduction of new terminology in the form of the term wadam, which is an early predecessor of waria, basically means the same thing. A combination of the words for Adam and Eve, interestingly. Ali Deakin, the governor of Chile from 1966 to 1977, played a crucial role in this effort, popularizing the term wadam and formalizing its use within the city bureaucracy. Those who identified with wadam or as wadam and later waria evaluated the creation and resultant proliferation of knowledge about the new term as an affirmative form of recognition tied to its connotation as a more modern and presentable term than banji, the older term. Waria is commonly reflected on this period as heralding an opportunity to achieve greater clarity and a more respectful term of address, even as the city administration framed gender nonconformity in terms of two entwined set of regulatory logics, those related to public order, ketertiban umum, and public morality, kesusilaan umum. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
I make a quick snap call.
Mhm.
Just a call for everyone to just feel welcome.
What we might do actually, on this note, I might suggest that an STS, as this is an STS style event, I might invite a style of moderation which is taken from Eve Tuck, which is at the end of any kind of like speaking event like this, to invite the audience just to take a minute to turn to each other, to speak to each other, to practice their questions before we then come in, for many reasons, one of which is not to bombard the speaker who's just been talking for some time, but also just as a moment to invite you, if you'd like to introduce yourself to the person next to you, to make sure you have a question and not a comment, and also to take snacks, go to the bathroom and come back, whatever you need to do, and we'll reconvene in a few minutes at 4:30 for a Q&A discussion with Ben. So please do so. We'll see you back here at 4:30. Same with those online. Thank you.
Books are for sale.
Yes, now is also a great time to grab a book, have a browse as well.
I don't know if that was just my mind. Like, I'm not a journalist, but I was like, how about you? I just coordinate the science and I'm like this, kind of work. Yeah. I mean, I was a woman anthropology. I was kind of solid. I was really I think not wearing something like you really struck you about this stuff. I think they want to know more about basically, I feel like
They're very specific, right?
I'm good.
Sorry.
It would be lovely to like speak to you.
So and that is going to this the smaller area. But actually, it's easy to add like 150,000 throughout the even but like actually our own yeah, that's about the things I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about like some movement. Do you think that that also considerability
really like yeah.
And then there are like some people migrate throughout the marriage, and some migrate here or also kind of like nowadays. I found it really interesting. But now it's like you want to get a citizenship here, you have to go through a really tax process. And then a lot of time you don't have the same rights as everyone else. So that makes it a lot of people are really vulnerable.
Okay, everyone. I'm now going to invite you all to come back. Hopefully you've had a little snack. Hopefully you've had a chance to chat with somebody next to you. If you have any questions, please do raise your hand and I'll throw to you. Online as well, feel free to post in the YouTube chat and our program coordinator, Karina, will read it out as your proxy. But to open us up, I think we'll go to some of the questions that were raised by some of our discussants. And I think the one that I'll open up with is the question at the end there posed by Carla, asking about the context within which we find the politics today, the increased criminalization, the increasing backlashes, the politicization of trans identities, and the morality politics that are following on from that. And what you as a scholar say and are able to speak back to those things that are happening at the moment and how your scholarship is situated in this current moment since you finished your fieldwork.
Thank you so much, Tal. I think that's a really nice question, a nice way to reflect on the kind of implications of the book and what it is. That coming through? Yeah, I think it's just dropping in and out a little bit. Yeah, the implications of the book for thinking about kind of the present, because a lot of the book addresses the kind of sweep of the 20th century and the ways in which public gender became central to organizing Indonesians' social life. Really governing through exclusion, right? The exclusion of certain bodies from public space and the inclusion of others. And that was really a defining component of what citizenship came to mean. So as people here may be aware, the Indonesian context has, like many others around the world, seen the rise of a certain kind of populist politics to which gender and sexuality plays perhaps an unexpectedly central role. So you see kind of forms of anti-feminist, what is sometimes termed anti-gender, and anti-LGBT politics, and Indonesia is no exception. So sometimes you'll see, very occasionally in the Australian media, discussion of the way in which the Indonesian Parliament proposed criminalizing homosexuality, for instance, quite recently in 2022, and I write in the book actually that where I conclude is that there were these enormous protests back in 2019, and what was really phenomenal about those protests. So the Indonesian government proposed to pass its new criminal code, which eventually was passed in a modified form in 2022. which included provisions to criminalize homosexuality explicitly. So in response to that, there were the largest public protests since the downfall of the New Order in 1998. And I think it's a moment that just kind of like came and then COVID came. But actually, what a phenomenal thing, right? That this brought together coalitions of labor activists, of feminists, of trans community members. I was here in Australia but watching closely what was going on. And that they managed to successfully push back against these proposed reforms at that time is a real testament to the importance, I guess, of both kind of these forms of coalitional politics, but also of showing up and understanding the implications, the political implications of these restrictions on gender and sexual conduct that go way beyond the individual, right? And kind of ideas about individual self-expression. And that's really kind of, I guess, central to the story of the book, is the ways that warias have really, in kind of really creative and impressive ways, pushed back against the regulation of their bodies and public expression, and really expanded a whole new way of thinking about and doing politics in Indonesian society. So the New Order was a place which was, I guess, binary gender, heteronormativity, was a central kind of component of how New Order development worked. So the roles of men and women were circumscribed. They were circumscribed in law. The idea that a woman was a housewife who would stay at home was a central component of, I would say, a civilizing mission, probably as much as anything else, so that rural people should emulate or take on certain kinds of middle class norms of gender, and that women should be primarily housewives and mothers. In that context, for waria to be able to negotiate and expand, I guess, understandings of gender in such a repressive environment, which also, it must not be forgotten, was a military regime which had no qualms about killing its opponents, including those in urban settings who kind of posed a threat to public order, is no mean feat. It's really something else. So I think there's so much to be learned from these really like tactical guerrilla style forms of political engagement with the meanings and terms of public agenda that refuse a monopoly on recognition, right? And that's really what was going on throughout, is that the state was attempting to impose a monopoly on recognition. These are the ways in which you might be recognized and identified. These are the terms on which that takes place. Waria never accepted those terms, and they turned from and where the state kind of failed to be a collective that would allow them to engage with others in ways that were important to them. They turned to other collectives, right, to try to forge different kinds of projects of mobilization and belonging, those being the neighborhood, society, and even the nation, right, as a distinct kind of idea or collective to that of the state. So I guess that's how I respond to that question.
And it really speaks a lot to Alegra's comments as well around the forms of resilience that you're able to highlight here, despite it being a very, a checkered history or a dangerous history or a difficult history to grasp with. I really enjoyed her comments around your ability to highlight the beauty of particular moments. And I wanted to bring us into a little discussion as well about how your work speaks to the discipline of anthropology itself. Alegra's comments also pointed to, and I think Carla's comments too also pointed to the way you conduct your work that isn't just about researching an elsewhere and researching others and doing sort of these damage-centered narratives, but able to do something else. I wonder if you could speak to the how you see your work as informing or building on the tradition of anthropology from which you're working.
Thank you. That's such a great question. And I think in responding to that, I think it's so important to understand and recognize, and I do some of that work in the introduction, the kinds of, I guess, colonial histories within which these forms of research are really embedded, and that continues to structure what knowledge is produced, who produces knowledge, and what matters, right? What actually gains traction at any point in time. So the role of anthropologists, if we just do like a little kind of weird rearview mirror, in early studies of, you could say, non-Western genders and sexualities, was kind of like a mapping. And one important anthropologist has called this kind of ethnocartography. So you kind of go out and you look for signs of gender variance and same-sex desire around the world, and you kind of plot those onto a map that looks so that they align with a kind of predetermined Western idea about what gender and sexuality mean, what gay identity or homosexuality and trans identities mean. And you see, I think, a continuation of that logic in lots of ways, and not necessarily by anthropologists. I think that this ethnocartographic logic, this mapping project of gender variance, goes on in lots of spaces, and in the way that we popularly imagine the definition of, say, what is transgender itself, what is the category transgender itself, who belongs, who's included, and who's excluded. And I think what happens sometimes in that process is that you get an emphasis on kind of, I guess, studies of waria, say, for instance, that automatically tend to equate them with tradition, right, with a kind of deep kind of history, and even an anti-colonial history, which in itself is not entirely incorrect, but I think somehow loses the agency of waria themselves, the political aspirations of warias themselves. Because, of course, the vast majority, if any waria at all, ever said that they imagine themselves in relation to authenticity and tradition. They said that they wanted to get a new term that would get them away from the old one, which was really derogatory. So they wanted to replace, basically make waria. And waria as a term draws on lots of different histories. It's really a hybrid. It draws on medical, like global ideas about transsexuality. It draws on kind of different understandings of the self, it draws on consumer capitalist ideas about beauty, right? So it's not a kind of singular essentialist thing. And I think that that's really important to kind of remember again and again, particularly when, say, teaching. I think gender and sexuality studies is interesting as well, right? Because it's not a field that's immune from kind of these forms of colonialism. So I think, for instance, the tendency to say, oh, we're going to have, a course on, on transgender, and then 1 week will be dedicated to the non-West, right? That, I think, sets up a kind of, in a sense, a problematic grid of difference that I think it's really important to question again and again. So I hope that my book has not just established like another case study, like in the library of to global gender variance. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I guess, in that sense, it's also about how you work. That matters just as much.
Just a reminder that if you have a question, just raise your hand. Was it? No. Sorry, I thought I saw a flinch in the audience. There is one. Yes, go on.
That's great.
Thank you so much for this beautiful book. I can't wait to read it, and the passages have been tantalizing. I was struck by Carla's comments about the richness of the archival research that you've done alongside the ethnography, and I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what that looks like, both materially, like what kinds of archives, and also your orientation to them in terms of the fact that it can be quite opaque, or that can be a lot of translation to locate a queer subject in an archive, in a colonial archive. So I wondered about that, the legibility, the translation. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really hard. It was really hard because these are not subjects who were, I guess, historical subjects who were legible in a way that makes it that you would easily like set out and say this is a kind of transgender history. It was located, say, in the minutes of the board the Commission for Public Nuisance in the Jakarta municipal government in the late 1960s. And among other things in that meeting, they were discussing like potholes and like the shacks being erected in illegal locations, traffic, whether to ban becak, the bicycle rickshaw, because of the emergence of the motor car. So I think that in itself tells such a particular story as to how waria were framed, that they were not really framed as gendered and sexual subjects precisely, but rather as a particular kind of public nuisance that had to be managed like other kinds of forms of material infrastructure in the city. So I guess that was the really interesting discovery, but I only came about this discovery. So obviously to find this stuff is like, it just takes a lot of time, and you see a reference in a newspaper, say the Department of Social Affairs will have its newsletter. You'll go through and you'll see a reference to a particular meeting, and then you go and go and try and find that meeting, right, or locate it. You'll have to kind of sit there and scour through pages and pages of text. But in any case, the most important component of the archival research was through ethnographic work, through the ways in which I really lived and worked alongside people and I guess participated in their political struggle in Jogja and Jakarta. So that involved, really getting to know people and trying to understand what people's understanding of their own history was, and then inquiring when they were, when they discussed or mentioned particular kinds of historical sources. So there's a really beautiful, the chapter that I really like is the last chapter, which is based on a collection of photographs, which were collected over the course of a lifetime of one waria who had also taken several of them, but who kind of kept all these photographs from the 1980s in a series of photo albums, and protected them from the weather, which was incredibly, and she lived in a very kind of precarious situation, but managed to kind of protect and keep them aside. So when I kind of discussed them with her and kind of unpacked the story of her life, these photos proved to be a really kind of incredible way of reflecting on public gender from another lens. That really emerged from people's own narratives themselves, and can't be read without that. So everything in the book started from there, from these kinds of relationships, and attempts to kind of understand the forms of inequality and exclusion that waria faced in public life in a way, and responded to it, and then sought to contextualize it out through this other kind of, more tricky work of like going through, the minutes of meetings and so on. So, but really, really difficult. And it's like I think it's important. Like, it's not like this was a kind of ready-made and easy archive that was kind of out there that I kind of just investigated. I was the one who compiled it and put it together. Yeah.
Another question.
Hi, Ben. Extraordinary book. I have a question, the answer which may be not really, but I'll put it out there. Alegra's comment about, kind of potential futures in which we see kind of greater integration of trans people into science in Indonesia, kind of brought to mind that the story that you're telling in the book is one that where the geneticization of sexuality and gender seems to be relatively absent. And so I wondered about if you could speak to the presence of genetic science in sex and gender in Indonesia, and maybe that's quite a contemporary question, or maybe it's a not really question, because I just think, here in the West, the geneticization of sex and gender, discourses like Born This Way have been so influential in many ambivalent and kind of hard to track ways. So I guess I wondered if you had any comment about that.
Yeah, this is so interesting, I think, and would be a really great study if someone would like to focus on this, this relationship between medicine and technology and sex and gender. so the Indonesian context is also one that is marked by deep and abiding economic inequality and access to medicine. And so over the course of the New Order, you kind of saw the establishment of primary healthcare centers throughout Indonesia, mostly related to maternal and child health and birth. In that context, you didn't, and these were relatively poorly resourced healthcare settings. So in terms of the capacity to undertake, and Indonesia, so that was the case then. Nowadays, Indonesia does have a kind of more encompassing healthcare system, a public universal healthcare insurance. It has it's expanding its healthcare infrastructure, but nevertheless, the workforce still has gaps, and also Indonesia is a very large place. So it really depends on where you live, right? Your capacity to access quality and kind of technologically advanced in this sense healthcare. So if I think if you're asking about, say, genetic testing, its availability and its influence, and also like the capacity to determine sex, sorry.
I mean along the lines of genetics as a kind of explanatory discourse, or that people may have recourse to say, well, sex and gender are actually genetically founded, and that whether or not that's an influential discourse in the kind of places that you're studying and people you're working with.
Yeah, so I would say less so in the course of everyday life. I mean, at the level of popular discourse or understandings of how sex works, I personally haven't encountered a kind of, that people just whip out genetics as like their go-to for talking about sex and gender. But you see, well, the New Order was a very technocratic state, right? It was a kind of founded on the centrality of science and technology to social reform, to modernization. That was a very depoliticizing project. And so in that context, you saw the, really doctors and scientists saying, well, yeah, sex is genetically determined. Yeah, there are males and females. They have these kind of attributes. They're distinguished naturally on a scientific basis. But these were also always, to my mind, quite partial and never really came to held sway in the way that you would imagine. And on the ground, they played out in really messy ways. So, I think intersex activists and I guess knowledge about intersex people and intersex activism in Indonesia has really pointed to the way in which this process of medicalization of the meanings of sex was very partial and incomplete and never quite came to have the grip it has, I guess, in other contexts. And people did really, I mean, there's cases I can talk about, really interesting cases, but people were able to kind of negotiate gender within its kind of social contexts that didn't necessarily always see the authority of science and medicine as the only form of authority. There were other forms of social authority that mattered just as much: religion, Islam, and the collective that you're belonging to, kinship and social belonging. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a mix, but yeah.
Brilliant. In the interest of leaving us enough time to individually line up and give you a time, I'm going to just end with a question now around the labour of making a book. And if just to invite you to, you had a really beautiful set of acknowledgements in the book, and if there's anyone you'd like to acknowledge and also speak to sort of the context of doing your work, I think it would be lovely to hear that as well.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, the acknowledgement section, the publisher, when they received it, was like, this is like another chapter. It really is quite long. But yeah, I mean, the whole book is grounded in, I guess, these relations that have been formed over so many years. that I've now been kind of working and traveling to Indonesia and working in Indonesia, and in increasingly really exciting ways that I really that are not the same as that which when I started out this book. I'm really proud of this book, and I think it's really awesome, but I'm really excited about the forms of work that I can do with people like Alegra, that I can do at the Kirby Institute with colleagues in public health in ways that are really addressing questions of justice and equity and access to healthcare. So all of that said, the people who have been so important have been, the people, many people in this room. I think, the Science at STS community here at Deakin I've been coming along to events for several years now, have really been a supportive space, I think, for this kind of work. And I remember thinking about that first one where it was Joe Latham and Jack Halberstam in conversation, where, feminist and queer approaches to science and technology were really central, I think, to the questions that you were asking, including your own work, Tal. So I think this community has been so important. My Indonesian collaborators have been really amazing and a source of inspiration and guidance, I think, in terms of how this work has come together and the implications I think that it has to have. Now, Alegra mentioned this importance for Indonesian doctors, scientists to kind of work with social scientists to understand the implications of, say, essentializing discourses, ways of understanding sex and gender, and to really address those head on. And I'm really excited to be able to work with people like Alegra, who's, among other things, a medical doctor, on those kinds of concerns, on those kinds of projects. The Indonesian academic community has been really important to my work. So I'm also an affiliated fellow at the Center for HIV and AIDS Research at the Atmajaya Catholic University in Jakarta. And I enjoy so much my intellectual engagement with that center. They do phenomenal work, and they really put questions of equity and justice as central to thinking about how you produce knowledge about the body, about health, in ways that translate really difficult concepts into the Indonesian setting. So I think it's so important to think about our interlocutors in a really messed up academic environment where there's so much pressure on us to do work which is often short-term and oriented towards very narrow audiences. How can we continue to be in dialogue in the languages that we work in? It's about to come out under translation as well, which is exciting to me, but also see our Indonesian academic colleagues as colleagues and collaborators, rather than just as a way into a field. I think we really need to keep thinking really hard about that question and continue to challenge the ways that kind research is done in a kind of business as usual setting, and that's across all fields. That's not just anthropology, but that's equally in my own field, global health, and beyond.
That was so beautiful, and I think really speaks to sort of the care and thoughtfulness that you've put into the work that you've done here, but also you as a scholar. So thank you again. Thank you for today. Thank you for writing this beautiful book. Thank you for all the work that you do, and thank everyone here for joining us and helping us to celebrate. Please join me in celebrating and saying well done to Dr. Benjamin Hegarty.
Thank you, Tao.
Yeah, thank you
for your wonderful moderation, Tao, coming along and supporting SSN, your old home.
It's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure to come back here.
Thanks to Karina for all the amazing work and setting things up and everything going so smoothly in such a highly kind of technically complex environment.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Wonderful.